Hi everyone, we're back with episode 5 of Real World Rockets. This is Wally Schirra's Sigma 7 flight. This is the 6th manned flight, excuse me, 5th manned flight in the American space program. Considering there were only 6 flights in the Mercury program, that kind of threw me off. Launch in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, launch. Alright, this ought to run a little bit better now because, and as I say that, we're getting, okay, this ought to run a little bit better now because I've had the program running for a little while, so hopefully it shouldn't be an issue. Alright, we're going to spend some more time talking about the historical aspect of the space race during this flight because, once again, we have kind of a long flight without a whole lot of, well, interesting things to do with the capsule. So, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss what was going on in the space race at this point and some mission-specific stuff too. So, okay, as we get through 2,000 meters, this was an important flight because it was primarily based on evaluating the spacecraft and what the spacecraft could actually do. This was because they wanted to plan longer missions in the future for the Gemini program and obviously the Apollo program. So we had to find out if humans could survive for long periods of time in space. And we didn't know that. So what they did was they planned those. The previous 2 missions were both 3 orbits. This mission was planned to be twice as long, in 6 orbits. This way we could determine the effects of long-term spaceflight on a human and learn some more about how that worked. I'm going to throttle up a little bit here, and then we're going to start our gravity turn. Now, the Soviets were, at this point, still slightly ahead of us in the space race, us being the Americans. This wasn't the first time this had happened. The Soviets were perceived as being ahead of us even when we were still in suborbital flights. Of course, the Soviets had achieved orbit while we had only achieved 2 suborbital flights on the Mercury Redstone booster. I'm going to go to map view here so we don't run into the same problem we had last time. The Mercury-Atlas was then the American answer to putting a more powerful rocket on the pad. Now, that meant that the astronauts could spend some time in orbit. And once we had launched the 2 Redstone missions, the Soviets countered with some long-duration spaceflight. That was using, I think it's Vostok 3 and 4. Now, Vostok 3 actually set a spaceflight duration record, which we needed to equal. I think Vostok 3 set the record at something like 64 orbits. It was, I don't know, 4 days or something. So we knew it was technically possible, but we didn't know what effects it had on the pilot or anything like that. Just because, well, obviously the Soviets weren't too interested in telling us that kind of stuff. So what the Americans did, oh, well, I probably should have dumped that. Well, I'll dump the boosters now. And we don't need that. Get rid of the boosters. Okay. And so the Americans were planning a day-long mission for the Mercury capsule. This had been something that they had been planning on since the start of the Mercury program, and so they decided to do a 6-orbit program to see if that would work, to see if the capsule was technically ready. And so that's largely what this mission was. This mission was designed to pave the way for the last flight of the Mercury program, which flew something like 26 orbits. I'll have to check the stat on that. But this flight was primarily focused on evaluating the vehicle, and there were some minor scientific experiments, which we'll talk about, but for the most part, they needed to see if the capsule would behave itself. Now, right about here, it's actually about 30 seconds ago, Deke Slayton got on the comm and asked Wally Schirra if he was a turtle today. He asks, "Are you a turtle today?" Now, Schirra was actually kind of surprised by this because it was an inside joke amongst the astronauts. It was kind of a challenge and password attempt, and so if you couldn't give the correct answer, you had to buy a round of drinks. Now, the correct answer to the question, "Are you a turtle today?" is, "You bet your sweet ass I am." Now, Schirra did not want to say that on national television, so what he did was he actually recorded it on the flight recorder, and so they could listen to it later. It's actually listed on the transcript of the flight as correct answer given. So it's just kind of one of those things. It's it's a bit of historical information for you. Okay, so as we're coming up through 140K, you can see our booster engines are right there. Those would have been dropped a little bit earlier in the flight. I'm not as familiar with the operations of this particular lifter when compared to the others, especially the Saturn V, but I don't know. It's a fun ship to fly anyway. Okay, coming up through 150, still got a bit of coasting. Schirra was an engineer, and he had a degree, I think, in mechanical engineering, and so he didn't have the same kind of background the other pilots did because he was, a scientist as compared to a pilot. The fun part about that is that Schirra named his spacecraft the Sigma 7 spacecraft. This was using the summation symbol in Latin, or of the Greek characters. He said it was an appropriate term, or an appropriate use of the character because it was a summation of human knowledge or something. I don't remember what the exact line was, but that's why the spacecraft is named Sigma 7, because it's a Greek character. It's the Greek character for in engineering, meaning summation of a whole. Okay, we're going to coast up here to Apo in about a minute and a half, and we're high enough that we can look at the planet now. I did launch this one pretty close to dawn for a change, so we can actually look at the whole planet this time. I like that the capsule's way over there, because the game focuses on the center of mass, which is somewhere in here. Okay. So, Schirra actually had a few problems with the booster, just like I kind of did. Right at the start of the launch, there was a 10-second roll. No, excuse me. It started at 10 seconds, and there was a roll in the spacecraft which was uncontrolled. And that was, like, mission critical. That was almost very bad, because they almost had to abort the flight for it, because they couldn't control it. They didn't know what the spacecraft was doing. So, what they did was they used the vernier thrusters. I'm not exactly sure if those are modeled on here to account for that, and it obviously didn't result in a mission scrub. I keep checking the map view because I want to burn at the right time. Still a little bit of ways out from Apo. Okay. Boy, am I really at 7 minutes already? I don't think I time warped or anything. Okay. Let's do our burn. Okay, so here we go. We are working on putting this into orbit. I'm just waiting for my periaps to come up. Around there it is. Okay, let's throttle down a little bit. And there. We'll call that circular. And it's not quite as good as the other one. But of course, the astronauts weren't trying to put their craft in circular orbits. They just tried to get into orbit. Okay, so we're going to ditch our booster. There we go. Looking good. Good stage separation. Boy, the texturing is really quite nice on that, isn't it? Just watch that for a minute. Okay, so at this point, Schirra had to test the capabilities of the spacecraft, and he did a lot of manual control testing. He said it felt sloppy compared to the traditional fly-by-wire system, and what they were doing was they were testing to see what the pilot could do to control the spacecraft in an emergency. It turned out that it functioned appropriately, but the spacecraft, as Schirra mentioned, was sloppy. I mean, it's kind of hard to control without the SAS on. But that's the way it goes. Okay, so he was given clearance for some 6 orbits once he reached the 3rd. And so once they got to a certain point, they were able to calculate whether the orbit was going to decay before they really were able to perform their scientific experiments. This capsule proved that it was capable of flying for 6 orbits, and Schirra spent something like 9 hours in weightlessness. Okay, so some of his scientific experiments that he was requested to do were he was actually asked to spend some time photographing the planet. This was a bit of an issue because there was quite a bit of weather over the areas he was asked to photograph, and his exposure settings weren't quite right. I'm not 100% sure what the deal was with that. But he wasn't quite able to do that. He did do something almost exactly like what we're doing right now. He actually did watch his booster float slowly past. He didn't make any effort to approach the booster, so we aren't going to do that either. Okay. It's starting to pass into night. Schirra spent a lot of his time alternating between both manual control and the automated. Okay, I'm gonna warp through the night side of the planet just because it's not fun to watch. We're gonna fly this whole mission at kind of higher warp, but this way we're not gonna spend any time in map view. Just because I want to see how that works. I want to see if you guys like looking at the planet, and frankly, it is kind of nice to just look down at it. Wally Schirra was asked to observe a flare being fired in Australia, as well as a light in South Africa. And of course, his orbit was not equatorial, because they were launching from Florida, which is clearly not on the equator. But the weather prevented him from seeing those tests. He did, however, mention that he was able to see the outline of Brisbane. It was all lit up, obviously. And so he was able to see the outline through the clouds. Other than that, he spent his time observing the planet. He also confirmed that John Glenn's fireflies were a thing. I mean, if you only have 2 pilots ahead of you, and there wasn't much information on that, and so he did confirm the fireflies, and like Glenn and Carpenter, he spent some time watching them. But he was largely in space to test the technical capabilities of the spacecraft. Okay, so we're going to call that's about an orbit. Now that we're getting into the night side, we're going to warp again. Okay. Let's spend this at a bit of a, well, it's too bad there's not a 20x warp. That'd be kind of nice. So I'm going to take SAS off. I'm going to drop out of warp to do that. Schirra reported this as chimp mode. He called it, oh, that's high warp. He called this being in, it's not chimp mode, it's something like that. Because the chimpanzees obviously weren't capable of piloting the spacecraft, so the spacecraft was on automated. And I'm going to call SAS mode the automated mode, or what Schirra would refer to as chimpanzee mode. He spent time in both modes, and like I mentioned before, he did not like the manual style of piloting as compared to the automated. You can probably hear my cat. My cat's coming down here to say hello. I'm in the basement to do my recording, and the cat likes to spend some time down here. So if you hear the cat, that's what he's doing. It's actually a remarkably friendly cat. They're not typically all that friendly, but this one is. Okay, coming around on our third orbit here. Schirra took his spacecraft off of automatic control and actually turned off all the gyroscopes. So you could say that's kind of what we're doing right now. He spent some of the third orbit eating. He found that somebody had left him a steak sandwich in the capsule before launch, and so he ate a light meal during the third orbit and spent some time talking about how the spacecraft was performing and everything else. Schirra also made quite a few public statements during his flight. He spent some time talking. He actually spent it was quite a bit of time for a space mission. He spent something like 5 minutes talking with John Glenn on broadcast channels. I don't remember if it was television or radio or what, but he spent quite a bit of time discussing the space flight with Glenn, and so he was well known for doing that. That's orbit 4. I'm just counting so we get it right this time. He also, immediately before re-entry, was asked if he had anything to say in Spanish to the people of Mexico as he flew over their country. He said it was a beautiful country and it was very nice to see it, and then he ended his transmission with "Buenos dias, y'all." But he later reported that he was furious that they would ask him that. He didn't want to spend the time worrying about it because he was preparing for re-entry at that time. As we will be doing rather shortly here, we are coming up on our 5th orbit at this point. Coming around the planet here. There it is. Sunrise. Alright, so now that we're at about 5.5, I'm going to start planning. Well, let's see. I suppose I could actually deorbit right now, couldn't I? If I'm going to land in there. Now, Schirra was very, very accurate in his landing. He managed to land only like half a mile from his primary target, the carrier Kearsarge. Since Africa, or the Kerbal Africa, is in the night side of the planet right now. Oh, I don't want to do that. Since that's on the wrong side of the planet right now, I'm not going to worry too much about landing nearby, but I figure if we can land somewhere in this half of the planet, we'll be in good shape. So I'm going to start our deorbit burn right now. We'll just pretend I did it over here so that he can get in the full 6 orbits. His trajectory was good enough for, and I quote, at least 7 orbits, but they didn't have to deorbit early, as was always the concern. But he performed his mission as he was asked, and we're going to do our burn now. He performed his mission and flew his 7 or 6 orbits, and really proved the capabilities of the Mercury spacecraft. This would be important later on because Gordon Cooper, who would fly the next mission, had a much longer flight, a full day in space, and the Gemini flights coming up, which were in the planning stage at this point, were also rather time-intensive. Okay, I'm just going to zoom in here. We're just going to try and aim right off the coast. We'll call that landing on target. And I know we're going to lose some velocity, but that's okay. And now we can enjoy our descent, at least until 159K, when the render distance becomes an issue, and then I will switch over. Okay, I'm going to dump our retrofire package. Yeah, we're definitely deorbiting. I'm going to dump that as such. There it goes. Okay. And let's get a little bit set up for re-entry. You can see I'm still fighting the quirks of the old SAS system. Once we get to Gemini, I think I'll try and do the same kind of recording format in 0.21. Let me know what you think of this. I think it looks much better, and it seems to run smoother as well. The recording software just doesn't like it in full screen as well, I guess. So we're not going to worry too much about that. We'll call the early missions, we'll say that the early missions in the series were just recorded with older cameras. I mean, come on, it's 1961. And 62, I guess. So, yes, at this point, we were trying to catch up with the Soviets, and though this mission was not intended to approach their record of spaceflight duration, it was intended to prove that we could spend more time in space than our 3 orbit flights. And ultimately, the public reaction to this flight was not as overwhelming as it had been to other flights, because other issues were brewing. This flight occurred in October of 1962, which of course means that the Cuban Missile Crisis is right around the corner. And so that really became big news at that point. And it wasn't really, I mean, people didn't pay as much attention to this because we were concerned about, going to war with the Soviet Union. And so that became bigger news than the space flight at that point. So the space missions at this time, especially this one, were not as widely viewed, even though President Kennedy did visit Wally Schirra in training in September when he was training for this flight. Can't seem to get a good angle. I don't want to get the planet in view because, yeah, then we're going to lag. That's actually pretty good. Okay, coming down out of space, we're going to hit the atmosphere pretty quick. And so you can imagine how irritating it would be if you were asked to make a public statement at this point when you're preparing for re-entry. Schirra was well known as kind of a maverick in the program. He was always willing to speak his mind, even when it didn't necessarily make things easy for everyone else. As we'll discuss in the Apollo 7 video, there was a very famous incident where there was essentially a crew mutiny in Apollo 7. We'll talk about that. It's an interesting history, the history of American manned spaceflight. I don't know as much about the Soviet spaceflight as I do about the American, but I happen to be American, so I kind of like that a little bit better. Let's come down a little bit faster. There we go. Capsule's starting to straighten out. Okay. The re-entry, the plasma sheath should form right about now. How do you like that? I can see it. I don't know if you guys can yet. There, you can probably see that. Very pretty. I really do like the new re-entry effects. I mean, they're not so new anymore, but considering that I played this game back in 0.18 when there weren't re-entry effects, it really, really adds a lot. Okay, we're at about 4G now, doing better than last flight. We have a more shallow descent angle, I guess. Yeah, topped out at about 4G. That's pretty good. See the planet coming up on the bottom of the screen there? I'm going to dump our top decoupler. Get out of here. See, that wasn't an issue in the real flights because it had explosive decouplers on it, so it would have cleared the spacecraft instead of, grinding along the side of it. So Sigma 7 is actually the only Mercury capsule I've personally seen. It's in the Apollo or Space Hero Museum or something in Titusville, Florida. That's at Kennedy Space Center, and so they have the real capsule, the one that actually flew around the Earth, and boy, these things are small. I mean, it's like it's in the middle of a room, and you can just literally walk around it. It's probably not much bigger than. Well, I'm trying to think of something that everyone would know the size. I mean, it's smaller than you might think it is. The Kerbals are smaller in comparison to the capsule than the humans would have been. So yeah, I can't think of anything offhand, but it's quite small. I mean, you can look up the dimensions online. I don't happen to have the stats here, but you can definitely. I mean, it definitely is not somewhere you'd want to be for a long period of time. But those guys did it. They did what they had to, and so they had just a matter of time until they upgraded to a larger capsule, which they would do in 2 missions. But considering we're just coming down through 1,000 meters, we are gonna be able to look down now. Yeah, so we easily made a splashdown landing. Okay, so coming down through 500 meters. Chute's going to open pretty quick. There it is. Let's see just how we did. Oh, yeah, so we're way out in the middle of the ocean. But that's okay. We landed in daylight, and that's really kind of the important thing. I'm going to warp to splashdown, just so we don't spend a whole lot of time staring at a spacecraft just kind of doing nothing. Coming down through 200 meters. We'll watch the last 20 meters or so. It's too bad you can't see the water. It doesn't really give you a good scale or a good idea of distance, but that's alright. So, Wally Schirra actually did not blow his capsule here. He very famously refused to open the door to the capsule until he was on board the carrier. There he blew the door of the capsule open on the deck of the Kearsarge in order to prove that Gus Grissom hadn't blown his capsule door. What he did was he hit the release, and it left very obvious bruising on his hand. Since there wasn't any bruising on Gus Grissom's hand, it essentially proved that his capsule had been blown open due to a mechanical malfunction. And it really proved that Gus was telling the truth, that he hadn't blown the hatch, that he had a mechanical accident. This would later be a bigger deal, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so this is James, signing off.